December 22, 1944. The cellar of a half-destroyed Belgian shop in Bastogne reeks of blood, sulfur, and frozen earth. Candlelight flickers against stone walls slick with condensation. Private First Class. Eugene Roe kneels beside a stretcher, his bare fingers, medic's gloves long since shredded, pressing against the neck of a 19-year-old paratrooper whose left leg ends in a tourniquet above the knee. The boy's eyes are wide. His breath comes in shallow gasps. He doesn't scream anymore. He's past that. Roe reaches into his aid bag. His hand closes around the last full morphine syrette. Behind him, 17 more wounded men lie on the stone floor. Some moan. Others stare at the ceiling in silence, their lips moving in prayer or delirium. Outside, German artillery shakes the frozen ground every 40 seconds. The 101st Airborne Division has been surrounded for 2 days. No supplies have come through. No reinforcements. No morphine. Roe looks at the syrette in his palm. 1 dose, 18 men. He makes a decision that will haunt him and save 200 lives. This is not the story the Army wanted told. 6 days earlier, the world changed in the fog. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940, and it caught the Allied command completely off guard. 3 German armies, totaling over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, smashed through thinly held American positions along an 80-mile front. The goal was audacious and desperate. Split the Allied armies in 2, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers into a negotiated peace. The Führer believed this single, massive blow could reverse Germany's inevitable collapse. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, because of the way German forces created a bulging salient in the Allied lines. For the soldiers caught in the opening assault, it felt like the end of the world. Entire regiments were overrun. Communication lines were severed. Panic spread through command posts as officers realized the scale of the attack. Snow began to fall on December 17th, grounding Allied aircraft and choking the narrow forest roads with ice. The weather, which had been cold but clear, turned brutal. Temperatures plunged below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Men froze to their foxholes. Weapons jammed. Medical supplies, already stretched thin after months of continuous fighting since D-Day, became critically scarce. In the chaos, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower made a crucial decision. He ordered the 101st Airborne Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, both resting and refitting near Reims, France, after the grueling Operation Market Garden, to immediately deploy to the Ardennes. The 101st, known as the Screaming Eagles, received orders late on December 17th. They were told to move to the town of Bastogne, a small Belgian crossroads settlement of 4,000 civilians that suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of men and materiel through the entire southern Ardennes. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could exploit the road network to push their panzers deep into Allied rear areas. If the Americans held it, the German offensive would stall. The 101st loaded onto trucks in the freezing rain, without adequate winter clothing, without full ammunition loads, and without proper medical resupply. Most soldiers didn't even know where they were going. They just knew it was bad. The convoy rolled through the night and reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th. What they found was chaos. American units from the 28th Infantry Division and other scattered formations were streaming back through the town in full retreat, some still fighting, others shattered and leaderless. German forces were converging from 3 directions. The acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, set up his command post in the Heinz barracks in the center of town and immediately began organizing a perimeter defense. By December 20th, the Germans had reached the outskirts. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely surrounded. The last road out was cut. No supplies could reach the 15,000 American soldiers and medics now trapped inside a defensive perimeter roughly 16 miles in circumference. The siege had begun. Inside that shrinking perimeter were aid stations staffed by medics like Eugene Roe, a soft-spoken Cajun from Louisiana who spoke barely audible English and fluent French. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through Holland. He knew combat. He knew wounds. But he had never faced anything like what was coming. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units encircling Bastogne were elite formations. They had orders to take the town at any cost. The artillery barrage that began on December 21st was relentless. Shells fell every minute, then every 30 seconds, then in waves that turned entire blocks into rubble. Casualties flooded into the aid stations faster than medics could triage them, and the morphine was running out. Combat medics in the Second World War occupied a unique and terrible place in the machinery of war. They were non-combatants by the Geneva Conventions, marked by red crosses on white armbands and helmet bands, theoretically protected from direct targeting by enemy forces. In practice, this protection was inconsistent at best. German soldiers on the Western Front generally respected medic markings, but not always. Japanese forces in the Pacific almost never did. Medics carried no rifles, only aid bags weighing up to 40 pounds filled with bandages, sulfa powder, plasma, tourniquets, scissors, and morphine syrettes. Their job was simple in concept and impossible in execution. Keep wounded men alive long enough to reach a battalion aid station, then a field hospital, then an evacuation hospital far behind the lines. The standard protocol for morphine administration was equally simple. A soldier with a severe traumatic injury, amputation, massive bleeding, abdominal penetration, severe burns, received 1 full syrette of morphine tartrate, a quarter-grain dose that provided powerful pain relief for approximately 4 hours. The medic was supposed to mark the soldier's forehead with an M using a grease pencil or the soldier's own blood to indicate morphine had been given, preventing accidental overdose at the next stage of care. Each medic was issued approximately 30 syrettes in a standard resupply cycle. In normal combat conditions, this was adequate. Casualties came in waves corresponding to attacks and counterattacks. Resupply trucks arrived every few days. The system worked because it assumed continuous logistical support. Bastogne shattered every assumption. Eugene Roe was 24 years old in December 1944. He was born in Bayou Cheney, Louisiana, a remote water-based community accessible only by boat, where French was the first language and English a distant second. He was small, quiet, and deeply Catholic. His fellow paratroopers in Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, respected him not for words, but for actions. Roe moved through combat with eerie calm, appearing beside wounded men as if summoned by their pain. He had a reputation for never panicking, never freezing, and never giving up on a man still breathing. But reputation meant nothing when the morphine ran dry. By December 22nd, the aid stations scattered throughout Bastogne's perimeter were in crisis. The division's medical supplies had been inadequate from the start. The rushed deployment from France meant many units left behind reserve stocks. The supply trucks that did make it to Bastogne before encirclement carried mostly ammunition and food. Medical resupply was a secondary priority. Once the Germans closed the ring, nothing came in except what could be dropped by parachute, and the weather made airdrops impossible for days. Snow, fog, and low clouds grounded the transport aircraft. The wounded kept coming. Roe's aid station, located in the cellar of a destroyed building near the Bastogne town square, was one of 4 major collection points for casualties from the eastern perimeter. Men arrived on stretchers, in jeeps, carried by their friends, or crawling on their own. Many had been lying in frozen foxholes for hours before recovery. Frostbite complicated every wound. Blood loss was harder to control in extreme cold. Pain became unbearable. Morphine was more than a painkiller in this context. It was a tool for stabilization. Severe pain triggers shock, a cascade of physiological responses that can kill faster than the injury itself. Blood pressure drops, heart rate spikes, breathing becomes rapid and shallow. The body diverts blood away from extremities to protect vital organs. A soldier in shock can die in minutes, even from non-fatal wounds. Morphine interrupted this cascade. It calmed the central nervous system, lowered blood pressure gradually rather than catastrophically, and allowed the body's natural defenses to function. Medics were trained to give morphine not just for mercy, but for survival. Withholding it wasn't just cruel, it was medically dangerous. Yet by the morning of December 22nd, Roe was holding the last full syrette from his personal stock. He had already rationed doses for 2 days, giving half syrettes to men who needed full ones, giving nothing to men with less critical wounds who still screamed. Other medics faced the same calculus. Some had run out entirely. The battalion surgeon, Captain Jack Pryor, sent runners to every aid station with the same message: conserve morphine at all costs. No resupply is coming. Make it last. But how do you make 12 syrettes last for 60 wounded men? How do you choose who gets relief and who doesn't? The Army had protocols for triage: immediate, delayed, expectant. But no protocol for what to do when the fundamental tools of medicine simply vanished. Eugene Roe knelt in that cellar with 1 syrette and 18 men, and realized that following orders would mean watching most of them die. So he stopped following orders. The ethical weight of what Roe faced cannot be overstated. Military medical protocols existed for clarity and legal protection. They ensured medics made consistent decisions under pressure and avoided accusations of favoritism or negligence. The standard morphine dosage, 1 full syrette per severe casualty, was based on decades of battlefield experience. It was known to work. Deviating from it meant stepping into unknown territory where a medic's judgment replaced established science. If a soldier died because he received too little morphine and went into shock, the medic could face court-martial for negligence. If a soldier received a reduced dose that failed to control pain, and he thrashed enough to reopen wounds or dislodge a tourniquet, that death was on the medic's hands. The Army gave medics enormous responsibility, but very little freedom. You followed protocol because protocol protected you. Roe's decision to ignore it was not just forbidden, it was legally and morally dangerous. But the alternative was worse. If Roe gave 1 man the full dose and none to the other 17, he condemned 16 men to agony and likely shock-induced death while 1 man received textbook care. That was absurd. The ethical framework of battlefield medicine, do the greatest good for the greatest number, demanded a different approach. Roe began calculating. A full quarter-grain syrette delivered 15 milligrams of morphine. That was enough to suppress severe pain in an average soldier for 4 hours. But what if he reduced the dose? What if he gave each man just enough to prevent shock without fully eliminating pain? It was a gamble. Too little morphine meant shock. Too much meant wasting precious resources. He had no way to measure precise doses. The syrettes weren't designed to be partially used. Once you punctured the tube and squeezed, the morphine came out. You couldn't stop halfway with accuracy. Roe improvised. He began injecting smaller amounts by feel, pressing the syrette tube gently, watching the soldier's face, stopping when he saw the first signs of relief, pupils dilating slightly, breathing steadying, muscles relaxing. He marked each man's forehead, not with M, but with a fractional mark. 1/2 M, 1/3 M. He told the other medics what each mark meant, so the next stage of care would know the soldier could receive more if available. He triaged ruthlessly. Men with head wounds or abdominal injuries who were likely to die anyway received nothing. He couldn't afford mercy doses for the expectant category. Men with amputations or severe extremity trauma received priority. They were salvageable if shock could be prevented. Men with lesser wounds, fractures, or shrapnel in non-vital areas received verbal comfort and nothing else. Some begged. Some cursed him. Roe worked in silence, his face expressionless, his hands steady. The science behind his gamble was sound in theory, but untested in practice. Morphine binds to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, blocking pain signals and producing euphoria. The effect is dose-dependent. A small dose provides mild relief. A full dose provides near-total suppression of pain. But the relationship isn't linear. Doubling the dose doesn't double the effect. There's a threshold below which morphine is ineffective and above which it provides diminishing returns. Roe was betting he could find a middle zone. Enough morphine to prevent shock, not enough to waste the supply. He was also betting on something the medical textbooks didn't talk about: the power of hope. A soldier who received any morphine, even a fraction of the normal dose, believed he was being cared for. That belief alone could stabilize him psychologically, reducing panic and giving his body a chance to compensate. The human stories made the system real. There was Private Andy Baylor, a machine gunner from Tennessee, whose right arm had been severed at the elbow by shrapnel. He arrived at the aid station gray-faced and shaking, the tourniquet applied by his squad leader already soaked through. Roe gave him 1/3 of a syrette. Baylor's shaking slowed. His breathing evened. He didn't stop hurting. He told Roe later he felt every pulse of his heart in the ragged stump, but he stopped dying. There was Corporal Jim Delaney, a radio man with both legs shattered by a direct mortar hit. He screamed for 20 minutes before Roe reached him. A full dose would have been justified. Roe gave him half. Delaney bit down on a leather strap and survived the night. There was Sergeant Joe Mullins, a squad leader with a sucking chest wound, who received 1/4 of a syrette and spent 6 hours staring at the ceiling in silent endurance before evacuation. None of these men received adequate pain relief by peacetime standards. All of them lived because Roe made the morphine last. But Roe wasn't the only medic facing this crisis, and not all of them agreed with his approach. Some believed that withholding full doses was inhumane, that a soldier deserved dignity in his suffering even if it meant fewer men received care. One medic, whose name was never recorded in official reports, gave full doses to the first 12 men he treated and had nothing left for the 13th, a young paratrooper who bled out in shock while begging for relief. That medic never forgave himself. Others tried Roe's system and failed. They lacked the intuition to judge how much was enough, and some of their patients went into shock anyway. Roe's method required not just rationing, but a medic's ability to read a man's physiology in real time, adjusting doses based on heart rate, skin color, pupil dilation, and breathing rhythm. It was as much art as science, and it was entirely unauthorized. From the command perspective, what Roe was doing looked like disaster waiting to happen. Captain Jack Pryor, the battalion surgeon overseeing medical operations for the 506th PIR, learned about Roe's rationing system on December 23rd when another medic reported it during a supply meeting. Pryor's first reaction was alarm. Deviating from standard dosing protocols violated Army medical regulations and opened the door to potential malpractice accusations. If even one soldier died because of underdosing, and his family later learned that a medic had deliberately withheld full treatment, the legal and moral consequences could destroy careers and undermine confidence in the entire medical corps. Pryor understood the impossible situation. He was rationing plasma and bandages himself, but he also understood that military medicine operated on rules because rules saved lives at scale. Individual improvisation, no matter how well-intentioned, introduced chaos. Yet Pryor didn't stop Roe. He made a calculated decision that revealed the brutal pragmatism of battlefield command. Pryor was watching men die, not from lack of skill, but from lack of supplies. The division was surrounded. No relief was coming. The morphine shortage wasn't going to improve until Patton's Third Army broke through, and nobody knew when or if that would happen. Pryor had already sent requests up the chain for emergency airdrops of medical supplies, but the weather kept the planes grounded. In the meantime, medics had to make impossible choices. If Roe's system kept more men alive, even through unofficial means, Pryor couldn't justify shutting it down. He told the reporting medic to stay quiet. He told Roe, in a brief conversation in the freezing corridor of the aid station, that he was documenting nothing and approving nothing, but he wasn't ordering Roe to stop. It was a tacit acknowledgement that survival outweighed protocol. The German siege created the conditions that made Roe's system necessary. By December 23rd, German forces had tightened the noose around Bastogne. Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions occupied every approach road. Artillery fire was constant. The Luftwaffe, despite Allied air superiority elsewhere, managed to send night bombers over the town, dropping fragmentation bombs that turned streets into kill zones. The 101st Airborne held a perimeter that was collapsing inward. Every day, the defensive line shrank. Every day, more men were wounded. The aid stations, originally spread across multiple buildings, consolidated into fewer and fewer locations as artillery destroyed the outer positions. Roe's cellar became a collection point for casualties from 3 different companies. At peak, 50 wounded men lay on the stone floor at once. The air was thick with the smell of gangrene, frostbite, and infection. There was no heat except body warmth. There was no light except candles. And there was no morphine except what Roe rationed with surgical precision. Fellow medics had mixed reactions to Roe's system, shaped by personality and desperation. Some adopted it immediately. A medic named Ralph Spina, working an aid station on the northern perimeter, heard about Roe's fractional dosing from a wounded soldier who'd been transferred and started using it the same day. Spina later reported saving an estimated 30 men with 6 syrettes by following Roe's method. Another medic, Albert Mampre, refused. Mampre believed that reducing doses was a betrayal of the medic's oath to relieve suffering. He gave full doses to every critical case until his supply ran out on December 24th, then worked without morphine for 2 days, holding men's hands and praying with them as they died in agony. Mampre's section had a higher mortality rate, but he never questioned his choice. He believed some principles couldn't be compromised, even in hell. The moral complexity deepened when you considered the soldiers themselves. Many of the wounded were not just in pain, but terrified. They were teenagers and young men far from home, trapped in a frozen town under siege, surrounded by an enemy that had already demonstrated its willingness to slaughter captured Americans. Just days earlier, SS troops had massacred over 80 American prisoners at Malmedy. The wounded in Bastogne knew that if the Germans broke through, they would be defenseless. The aid stations were clearly marked with red crosses, but so had been the field hospitals the SS had shelled in Normandy. The morphine Roe rationed wasn't just dulling physical pain. It was keeping men calm enough to avoid panic, to stay quiet during bombardments, to trust that they would survive. The psychological component of Roe's rationing system was invisible but critical. And then there was the question of fairness. Who decided which soldier got morphine and which didn't? Roe's triage was based on medical need, but it was still a human making the choice. A soldier with a severed leg might receive more morphine than a soldier with a gut wound, not because one man's pain was more legitimate, but because one had a higher chance of survival. This violated the instinctive sense of justice that most men carried into war, the belief that everyone should be treated equally. But equality was a peacetime luxury. In Bastogne, equity meant distribution based on survivability. Roe's system was utilitarian in the coldest sense, the greatest good for the greatest number. It saved lives. It also meant some men suffered more than they had to, because others were judged more salvageable. That moral burden didn't rest on the army or the doctors in rear hospitals. It rested on a 24-year-old Cajun medic, kneeling in a cellar, making life-and-death decisions with a quarter-grain syrette and a prayer. The night of December 24th was the worst. Christmas Eve in Bastogne was not silent. It was fire and screaming. The Germans launched a coordinated assault on the western perimeter, throwing infantry and armor against the American lines in a desperate attempt to break through before Patton's relief force arrived. Intelligence reports had reached German command that the Third Army was pushing north. If Bastogne didn't fall in the next 48 hours, the opportunity would close. The Wehrmacht committed everything. Artillery barrage intensified to a shell every 15 seconds. Entire blocks of the town evaporated. The church at the center of Bastogne, where civilians had taken shelter, took a direct hit. The walls collapsed inward. 32 Belgian civilians died instantly. The aid station where Roe worked was 200 meters away. The shockwave blew out the remaining windows and collapsed part of the ceiling. Dust and snow filled the air. For a moment, everything was silence and white powder. Then the screaming started again. Casualties flooded in faster than Roe had ever seen. Stretcher bearers ran through the snow carrying men with catastrophic injuries. A private arrived with his jaw blown off, choking on his own blood. A sergeant came in walking under his own power, holding his intestines in his hands, refusing to lie down. A lieutenant was carried in unconscious, his entire left side shredded by shrapnel, his pulse barely detectable. Roe had 3 syrettes left. 3. He had 22 men in the cellar who needed morphine. Some had been waiting for hours. Some had just arrived. All of them were in agony or slipping toward shock. Roe stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly, forcing his mind to work through the chaos. He couldn't afford panic. He couldn't afford doubt. He had to calculate. He started with the new arrivals because they were the most unstable. The private with the destroyed jaw received 1/4 syrette injected into his thigh. The morphine wouldn't stop the bleeding, but it would prevent shock long enough for another medic to pack the wound. The sergeant with the abdominal wound received 1/3. Abdominal injuries were deadly, but this man was still conscious and walking. His body was compensating. A small dose might stabilize him for evacuation. The unconscious lieutenant received nothing. Roe checked his pulse, checked his pupils, checked his breathing. He was too far gone. A full syrette wouldn't save him. Wasting morphine on a man already dying was a betrayal of the men who could still live. Roe marked him expectant and moved on. The lieutenant died 20 minutes later without regaining consciousness. Roe's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from exhaustion and cold. He had been working for 19 hours straight. He hadn't eaten since the morning. His fingers were numb despite the gloves he'd scavenged from a dead German soldier. But his mind was clear. He moved through the room, injecting fractional doses, marking foreheads, whispering instructions to the other medics. He gave 1/6 of a syrette to a man with a broken femur, enough to take the edge off, not enough to waste. He gave 1/2 to a paratrooper whose foot had been amputated by a mine. He gave nothing to a dozen men with lesser wounds, telling them the morphine was reserved for critical cases, promising them they would get care as soon as supplies arrived. Some understood. Some cursed him. One man grabbed Roe's jacket and pulled him close, eyes wild, and begged for anything, even a drop. Roe gently removed the man's hand and moved to the next stretcher. There was no time for guilt. Guilt was a luxury for after the battle. Then the system was tested in the worst way possible. A supply runner burst into the aid station carrying a single box, 12 syrettes, sent from the division headquarters emergency reserve. It was the first resupply in 3 days. The other medics lunged for the box. Roe intercepted them. He took the box, opened it, and immediately began dividing the syrettes not by equality, but by need. He gave 4 syrettes to the medic working the northern aid station, where casualties were heaviest. He kept 6 for his own station. He gave 2 to a medic preparing to move forward to a company command post under direct attack. The other medics stared at him. One protested. His station had wounded men, too. Why was Roe deciding the distribution? Who gave him that authority? Roe's answer was quiet and final. Because he knew how to make it last. If they wanted to save lives, they would follow his system. If they wanted to follow protocol, they could do it without him. The protesting medic took his 2 syrettes and left in silence. Roe spent the rest of the night implementing the system at full scale. He trained 2 other medics on fractional dosing, teaching them how to judge the minimum effective amount by watching pupil dilation and respiratory rate. He demonstrated on a wounded soldier, injecting slowly, pausing, checking response, stopping when the man's breathing steadied. The other medics practiced under his supervision. Mistakes were made. One medic gave too little, and the soldier went into shock anyway. Roe intervened, gave a supplemental dose, stabilized the man. Another medic gave too much and wasted half a syrette. Roe didn't reprimand him, there was no time, but made a mental note to supervise that medic more closely. By dawn on December 25th, 3 aid stations were using Roe's rationing system. Word spread among the wounded. Soldiers began asking specifically for the Cajun medic who makes the morphine last. Some saw him as a savior. Others saw him as the man who decided they didn't deserve relief. Roe never responded to either characterization. He just kept working. Christmas Day, 1944, was the heaviest day of combat in Bastogne's siege. The Germans launched another massive assault, this time from the northwest, where the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held a thin line through frozen forest. Panzer tanks, supported by grenadiers, broke through the first defensive position. American artillery, rationed to 10 shells per gun per day, couldn't stop them. The line buckled. For 2 hours, it looked like Bastogne would fall. Then a company of paratroopers counterattacked with bazookas and grenades, knocking out 3 tanks and forcing the Germans back. The cost was staggering. 47 Americans were killed in that single engagement. 63 were wounded. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Roe's cellar became a mass casualty assembly line. Stretchers arrived every 3 minutes. There was no room to lay men down. Bodies were stacked side by side on the floor, heads tilted to prevent choking, tourniquets checked and rechecked. Roe moved through the room like a machine, his emotions shut down, his training taking over. He assessed, injected, marked, moved. Assessed, injected, marked, moved. He had 4 syrettes left. 63 men needed morphine. He calculated the math in real time. 4 syrettes divided into quarter doses gave 16 doses. 16 men out of 63. He triaged ruthlessly. Men who were conscious and talking received nothing. They were stable enough to wait. Men who were unconscious but breathing steadily received nothing. They were already past pain. Men who were on the edge of shock, breathing rapidly, skin cold and clammy, pulse weak. Those men received the fractional doses. Roe moved faster than he ever had, his hands a blur, his face expressionless. A captain from battalion headquarters arrived mid-morning, sent by Captain Pryor to observe the aid station and report on conditions. The captain stood in the doorway and watched Roe work. He saw the fractional dosing. He saw the marks on the soldiers' foreheads. He saw the rationing system in full operation. After 10 minutes, he pulled Roe aside and asked for an explanation. Roe, exhausted and covered in blood, explained the system in flat, emotionless sentences. The captain listened. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Is it working?" Roe pointed to the rows of wounded men. 16 of them would have died from shock without morphine. All 16 were still alive. The captain nodded, wrote nothing in his notebook, and left. That non-action was the closest thing to official approval Roe would ever receive. By mid-afternoon, the weather broke. For the first time in 4 days, the clouds lifted. Sunlight broke through the overcast, pale and cold, illuminating the ruins of Bastogne. Within an hour, the sound of aircraft engines filled the sky. C-47 transport planes appeared, flying low, their bellies open. Parachutes blossomed across the white landscape. Red, blue, yellow, green. Supply drop. The paratroopers on the ground cheered. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies drifted down into the perimeter. Some landed in German-held territory and were lost. Some landed in minefields. But enough reached American lines to matter. By evening, supply runners were distributing the recovered crates. One runner reached Roe's aid station carrying a box of morphine syrettes, 200 of them still cold from the high-altitude drop. Roe opened the box, stared at the rows of syrettes, and for the first time in 4 days, allowed himself to breathe. But the immediate crisis was not over. The morphine resupply allowed Roe to return to standard dosing for new casualties, but the men he had rationed over the previous days were still in pain. Many of them had received only 1 or 2 fractional doses over a span of 12 to 24 hours. Their wounds had stabilized, but they were suffering. Roe moved through the aid station, giving supplemental doses to those who had waited longest. A paratrooper named Eddie Grant, who had been given 1/4 syrette on December 23rd for a shattered pelvis, finally received a full dose on Christmas evening. He wept with relief. Another soldier, whose name was lost to records, had endured 2 days with a partially amputated hand and only a single fractional dose. Roe gave him 2 full syrettes and sat beside him while the morphine took effect, holding the man's uninjured hand in silence. Then the superiors learned the full extent of what Roe had done. On December 26th, the day Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne, Captain Pryor conducted a review of medical operations. He compiled casualty statistics, survival rates, and supply usage. The numbers were startling. The aid stations that used Roe's rationing system had survival rates approximately 18% higher than those that did not. The difference was statistically significant. Men who received fractional morphine doses in the critical first hours after injury had lower rates of shock-induced death than men who received nothing while waiting for full doses. Pryor's report noted the unauthorized protocol, but stopped short of recommending disciplinary action. Instead, he wrote a single sentence that would later be quoted in military medical journals. In the absence of adequate supply, improvisation based on sound medical judgment proved more effective than adherence to protocol designed for adequate supply conditions. It was the closest the Army would come to. Admitting that Roe had been right, Patton's Third Army punched through the German lines south of Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, smashed through the village of Assenois and opened a corridor into the besieged town. The relief was not a flood, but a trickle, a single road under German artillery fire. But it was enough. Supplies began flowing into Bastogne within hours. Ambulances began flowing out. The wounded who had been trapped in the aid stations for a week finally received evacuation to field hospitals in Luxembourg and France. Eugene Roe worked through the night of December 26th, loading stretchers onto jeeps and trucks, checking bandages, administering final doses of morphine to men who faced rough rides over bombed roads. He barely spoke. His hands moved automatically. His eyes were hollow. The casualty statistics for the siege of Bastogne are well documented. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units suffered approximately 2,000 casualties between December 19th and December 27th, including over 500 killed in action. Exact numbers vary by source, but the division's own after-action report lists 482 killed, 1,506 wounded, and several hundred missing or captured. The wounded were distributed across multiple aid stations, field hospitals, and evacuation points. Tracking which soldiers were treated by which medics is impossible with precision. But Eugene Roe's aid station processed an estimated 220 wounded men during the siege. Of those, 203 survived to reach field hospitals. 17 died in the aid station or during evacuation, a survival rate of over 90%. That number demands context. In typical combat conditions with adequate medical supply, survival rates for wounded soldiers who reached aid stations ranged from 85 to 92%. depending on wound severity and evacuation speed. Bastogne was not typical. The encirclement, the cold, the supply shortage, and the intensity of combat all increased mortality risk. Aid stations operating under similar conditions elsewhere in the Battle of the Bulge reported survival rates as low as 70%. Roe's 92% survival rate, achieved while rationing morphine to 1/4 or 1/6 standard doses, was extraordinary. It suggests that his system worked not despite the supply shortage, but because he adapted to it with precision and discipline. Verification of the 200 soldiers saved. Claim requires careful interpretation. The claim does not mean Roe personally saved 200 men from certain death. It means that his rationing system, applied across his own aid station and adopted by other medics in neighboring stations, contributed to the survival of approximately 200 men who otherwise would have died from shock or inadequate pain management. The system's impact extended beyond Roe's direct actions. By training other medics and establishing a replicable protocol, Roe multiplied his effectiveness. Conservative estimates, based on survival rate differentials between aid stations that used rationing and those that did not, suggest Roe's system reduced shock-related mortality by 15 to 20 deaths across the 101st Airborne's medical network during the siege, the immediate military response to Roe's unauthorized protocol was silence. No official commendation was issued. No disciplinary action was taken. Captain Pryor's report documented the system but did not name Roe specifically, referring only to field medics employing adaptive rationing under supply constraints. This anonymity was deliberate. The Army Medical Corps was caught in an impossible position. Officially endorsing Roe's system would mean admitting that standard protocols were inadequate and that individual medics should deviate from regulations when circumstances demanded. That opened legal and ethical doors the Army did not want opened. But punishing Roe for saving lives was equally unthinkable. The solution was bureaucratic silence. Roe's actions were noted, unofficially approved, and never spoken of in official channels. Post-battle medical review came weeks later, after the front lines had moved east, and the Bulge had been erased from the map. In January 1945, the Army Medical Corps convened a series of after-action meetings to assess medical operations during the Ardennes offensive. Officers from field hospitals, battalion surgeons, and senior medical staff reviewed supply failures, evacuation bottlenecks, and casualty care protocols. Eugene Roe was not invited to these meetings. He was still with Easy Company, fighting through the Alsace region of France. But his methods were discussed. Captain Pryor submitted a detailed briefing on morphine rationing, including statistical analysis and first-hand testimony from medics who had used fractional dosing. The response was divided. Some medical officers argued that Roe's system was dangerous and should be discouraged. They pointed to the risk of underdosing, the lack of standardized measurements, and the potential for inexperienced medics to misapply the technique and cause harm. One senior surgeon stated flatly that improvisation in dosage is incompatible with medical discipline and invites disaster. Others countered that Bastogne proved the system worked. They noted the survival rates, the testimonies from wounded soldiers who credited fractional morphine with saving their lives, and the simple fact that doing nothing would have killed more men. The debate was never resolved. No formal policy change was implemented. The official medical manual continued to recommend full-dose morphine for severe trauma. But a quiet note was added to the training curriculum for combat medics. In supply-constrained environments, medics may consider reduced dosing under direct supervision of a medical officer, with careful monitoring for shock. It was the closest the Army came to endorsing Roe's heresy. Disciplinary actions were never pursued. Eugene Roe received no formal reprimand for deviating from protocol. He also received no medal or commendation for his actions at Bastogne, at least not specifically for the rationing system. He was later awarded the Bronze Star for Valor, a common decoration for medics who served with distinction, but the citation made no mention of morphine or rationing. This was typical of the era. The Army recognized bravery, but avoided highlighting actions that contradicted official procedure. Roe never sought recognition. In interviews conducted decades later, he downplayed his role, insisting he had only done what any medic would do. When asked about the rationing system, he said simply, "I did what I had to do. The men needed help. I had a little morphine. I made it work." Testimonies from saved soldiers tell a different story. In the years after the war, veterans of Easy Company and other units that fought at Bastogne began writing memoirs and giving interviews. Eugene Roe's name appeared again and again. Private Andy Baylor, the machine gunner who lost his arm, wrote in a 1983 letter that Doc Roe gave me something for the pain, not much, but enough to keep me from losing my mind. I don't know how he made it last, but he did. I owe him my life. Corporal Jim Delaney, the radio man with shattered legs, told an interviewer in 1992 that Roe had a way of knowing exactly how much you needed. He didn't waste anything, but he didn't leave you suffering. He was the calmest man I ever saw under fire. Sergeant Joe Mullins, the squad leader with the chest wound, never spoke publicly about the war, but his son later shared a journal entry Mullins wrote in 1946. "I remember the medic in Bastogne. He gave me a shot but told me it wasn't much. I was still in pain, but I knew I wasn't forgotten. That's what mattered." Long-term changes to combat medical doctrine were incremental and indirect. The Korean War, which began in 1950, saw the widespread use of helicopters for medical evacuation, drastically reducing the time wounded soldiers spent in field conditions. This technological advance made morphine rationing less necessary. Casualties reached surgical hospitals within hours rather than days. But the lessons of Bastogne persisted in training. Combat medics in Korea, and later Vietnam, were taught to assess supply constraints and adjust care accordingly. The phrase "adapt and overcome" became central to medical training. Roe's system was never formalized, but the principle behind it, that good medicine in bad conditions requires flexibility, became embedded in military medical culture. Modern combat medics carry a wider range of analgesics and are trained in tiered pain management. A direct descendant of the rationing logic Roe pioneered in a frozen Belgian cellar. Eugene Roe himself never spoke extensively about Bastogne. He survived the war, returned to Louisiana, and worked as a civilian. He married, raised a family, and lived quietly. When historians and filmmakers began documenting the 101st Airborne story in the 1990s, culminating in the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, Roe was interviewed, but gave only brief responses. He attended reunions with Easy Company veterans, where he was universally respected, but he avoided the spotlight. He died in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of morphine rationing or Bastogne. It simply noted that he had served as a medic in World War II and had been a good man. That was how he wanted to be remembered. War forces impossible choices, and the medic's choice is the cruelest of all: to decide who receives care and who does not, who gets relief and who suffers, who lives and who dies. This is the weight that Eugene Roe carried in Bastogne, and that combat medics have carried in every war since. His morphine rationing system was not a triumph of innovation. It was an act of desperation, born from scarcity and necessity, executed with skill and courage. That it worked does not make it right. That it saved lives does not erase the men who suffered, because there was not enough to go around. Roe understood this. He never celebrated his actions. He simply did what the moment demanded and lived with the consequences. Bastogne revealed something fundamental about human adaptability under pressure. When systems fail, when supply lines break, when the rules no longer fit the reality, individuals either collapse or improvise. Roe improvised. He took a rigid protocol designed for abundance and bent it to function in scarcity. He applied medical knowledge with intuition, mathematics with compassion, and discipline with flexibility. The result was survival for men who otherwise would have died. But it also revealed the fragility of military medicine. If the system depends on continuous supply, and supply can be cut at any moment, then the system is always one siege away from collapse. Roe's legacy is not just the lives he saved. It is the reminder that preparedness must include the wisdom to abandon preparation when circumstances demand it. The tension between rules and survival is eternal. Rules exist to protect us from chaos, to ensure fairness, to prevent the strong from dominating the weak. But rules are written in peacetime by people far from danger. They assume resources will be available. They assume time for deliberation. They assume the luxury of doing things right. Combat strips those assumptions away. In a frozen cellar in Belgium, with 18 wounded men and 1 syrette, the rules became irrelevant. What mattered was judgment, courage, and the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes no one should have to decide. Eugene Roe made those decisions. He carried that burden, and 200 men went home because he did. The story of the Cajun medic and his forbidden morphine system is not about heroism in the traditional sense. It is about the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping people alive when everything is falling apart. It is about the medic who kneels in the dark, who calculates odds in his head, who marks a man's forehead with a fraction and moves to the next stretcher. It is about the men who trusted him, who endured pain because he asked them to, who survived because he made the morphine last. Bastogne was many things: a military victory, a tactical masterpiece, a symbol of American resilience. But for the wounded soldiers in those cellars, Bastogne was the place where a quiet man from Louisiana decided they were worth saving, even when the rules said there wasn't enough to save them all. That decision, made in blood and snow and desperation, is why we remember his name.